Hello, this is Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association. We are excited today to continue our MASBA Aprendemos webinar series with a tremendous speaker who is the co-founder of Hope for the Wounded and also the author of various works, including Reaching the Wounded Student, 7 Ways to Transform the Lives of Wounded Students, and Supporting the Wounded Educator. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Joe Hendershot.
Thank you, Dr. Mathias. I appreciate that.
Tremendous. Great to have you with us, and we are so looking forward to hearing all about this. I've heard so many great things about you through the years, and I know that you're a fellow Buckeye. So Dr. Hendershot, take it away and tell us all about today's theme.
Well, today we're going to talk about wounded students. We're going to talk about the difference between at-risk and wounded students. Just to give a little background of, if I have to listen to somebody for about an hour, I want to know a little bit about them. I want to know a little bit about where they're coming from on this topic. I spent about 22 years in public schools, head high school principal, assistant principal, did that for about 5 years, but really found my passion, my calling, if you will, working with what we would normally call at-risk youth. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I ended up working in treatment centers, at-risk facilities, alternative school settings, juvenile prisons, and I was a recreational therapist and became principal of Boys Village School, which is a residential treatment center. So that's my background professionally. I did my work at The Ohio State University and got my master's and doctorate at Ashland University. So that's my professional background. Personally, I have 9 children. You can probably see them on the screen there. My 5 oldest children are teachers. I have 4 young children that we've adopted. They want to grow up to be like their brothers and sisters, and they want to be teachers as well. So we're single-handedly trying to stop the teacher shortage in the United States today with our family. So, and my wife there in the picture is co-founder of Hope for the Wounded and co-authored the book Supporting the Wounded Educator that just was released in February of this year. So that's my personal professional background. So any specific questions, Jamie, or you want me to just run with it?
Go for it. We are excited to have you here, Dr. Hendershot.
Okay. Well, you heard my background, where I worked, and I always talk the work with at-risk kids, and I at-risk training. Like many of you, went to at-risk seminars, at-risk conferences, read about at-risk books about at-risk kids, and I would go to conferences and I would read books, and I would catch myself failing miserably actually doing this, and I felt like I had a real heart, a real passion for doing it, but really wasn't successful at it. So I kept at it, and really wasn't sure what it was I was looking for, Jamie. Was just kind of knew there was something that was missing. Well, something happened a number of years ago. My son, who was about 4 years old at the time, was hurt very bad in an accident at our house, and I was at work. And my wife called me afterwards, and she said, "Joe, everything's fine now." She said, "But I want to tell you what happened today." She said, "Our son Kyler, who was about 4 years old at the time," she said, "I was hurt very bad in an accident at the house." She said, I had to decide whether to call the squad or rush him to the hospital. As most parents would do, you want to get your son critical care help right away. Probably should have called the squad and waited patiently, but she threw our son in the back side of the car and strapped him in and was racing 90 miles an hour to the hospital to save our son. And I'll also add in there, she was driving 90 miles an hour through a school zone. She gets picked up by the police officer. Police officer goes up to the car, was ready to throw the book at her, because there's rules about going 90, especially through a school zone. And he had this rule book, and he was ready to throw the book at her. And as he was getting ready to do that, he looked in the back seat and he saw a wounded child. The police officer put that rule book aside, and he had to have a different set of training that was taking place. He had to have a different paradigm to be a first care responder in the lives of wounded people. His job wasn't to be a surgeon. His job was to be a doctor, sew my son back together, none of those things, but to be a first care responder. So the police officer pulled out his other set of training, escorted my wife and son to the hospital, got my son critical care that he needed with the experts. My wife tells me the story. Everything ended up being fine, thank goodness, and everything we appreciated from the police officer. But my wife told me about the story. I thought, maybe that's it. Maybe that's what I've been missing, because my son was not at risk. He was a wounded child. And the way the police officer responded showed me that we have kids beyond that risk who are wounded. And I'm not saying we don't have at-risk kids, but usually in education, when we talk about at-risk means they're at risk of falling behind grade-wise, falling behind academically, falling maybe not into graduation, in line in time. That's usually about. We don't talk about at risk of suicide, at risk of trauma, abuse, neglect, and all those things. So when people ask me for a definition of what are we talking about wounded kids, I say they're simply kids beyond that risk. And I want to say this today, and kind of in light of everything that's going on in the world, and I want to say to all the participants out there today tuning in, first of all, my thoughts and hopes and prayers go out to everybody across the world with this pandemic. And I hope that everyone is healthy and safe and well as your family and your friends. And but it ties into somewhat what we're talking about, that there's at risk and there's wounded, and we're kind of a wounded society right now, and we're trying to figure it out, and we're all kind of in the same boat, if you will. So I was asked to speak at a conference right after what happened to my son on an at-risk program I was doing, and I wasn't a presenter. I never presented at a conference, so I declined. But I called him back a couple weeks later and I said, you know what, I'll do the conference if you let me speak about wounded children. And they said, that sounds very interesting. What will you talk about? I said, I'm not real sure. I just want to see if there's anybody else out there that thinks we have kids beyond that risk that are wounded. This was in 2006. So I've been talking about this a long time, long before a lot of social emotional learning and stuff that has taken place in today's educational world. So I flew down to this conference. I agreed to do one session on at-risk children and one on wounded children. And I flew in, they said, you're Dr. Hendershot. They said, we have a real problem. They said, we have over 1,000 people signed up for your wounded student seminar. And I thought, I don't want to do this. I have never spoken in front of 20 people in my life. But just to prove the point, in my other session on at-risk kids, I had 17 people show up. Same conference, same day, same seminar, same presenter, different topic. So it was clear to me that people really, educators out there, superintendents or principals, really believe that we had kids beyond that risk. So I asked the question to you out there, and when I have a crowd of 500,000, 50 people, whatever I'm talking to, I ask these basic questions. And the questions are, how many of you out there believe that you have kids beyond that risk? Raise your hand. So I'm asking you to do that, though I can't see you. You can see me. How many of you believe we have kids beyond that risk? How many of you have felt like the police officer, the first care responder in the lives of these children's wounds? Now, I've presented at school resource officer conferences, counseling conferences, school psychologist conferences, K-12 conferences, college conferences, spoken in Australia, Alaska, all over I think 40 out of the 50 states that we've presented in. I've asked this question all over the world. Now, it's probably the most important question I ask. Usually I get all hands raised when they say they believe we have kids beyond that risk. Then I ask, how many of you have found like the police officers, the first responder in the lives of these children's wounds? I get all hands raised. And then I ask the most important question is, how many of us feel prepared to deal with the trauma that kids are dealing with today? and usually I get 0 hands. I maybe collectively across the world in the past 13 years, I've asked that question. I maybe have had a dozen hands. So I think we do have kids. Now the research is clear, and I won't go into a lot of research, but the research says 47.9% of our kids today were dealing with trauma. This is before what we're dealing with today in today's world with the pandemic. The research said 47.9% of our kids today, almost half, that's 35 million kids. Anxiety and depression, Time Magazine did an article in 2016, and the research was clear on that nearly 3 million adolescents were dealing with depression. And the increase was going from 2006 when I started this of 7.9% to 12.5%. Anxiety by the number, 6.3 million teens between the age of 13 and 18 were dealing with an anxiety disorder. That's 25% of the population of our teenage population is dealing with anxiety. We have to ask ourselves now, are those numbers changing even now with anxiety, depression, woundedness? Those are answers I'm not sure I have today. I guess I'm just asking those questions. This year, the research for foster families, nearly 11 million children will be confirmed cases of abuse and neglect. 8,000 children will die of abuse and neglect, and we have a need for 7.2 million foster care homes in the United States today. These are real numbers: 35 million, 7.2 million, 11 million. Now, I just want to say this in light of all of that, just so you don't say you're going to spend an hour with Joe the Downer here, let's have some good news here. And the good news is we are at an all-time high for graduation rate in the United States, in spite of all the things we have to deal with, testing, now with this new virus. We're going to see how all this stuff plays out. But we're at a 40-year all-time high for graduation rate in the United States. So that's good news. But we're still losing about 20% of our kids. So we have to figure out, are these kids we're losing, are the 20% that we're losing, are they at risk or are they wounded kids? And is there a difference in how we deal with them? Now, the session today I'm going to talk about is not about guilt, it's about vision. If this was about guilt, I'd dismiss all of you from this webinar, and I could beat myself up pretty nice, wishing I could go back and do some things different. But I really wasn't trained in this in traditional university on how to deal with wounded kids. Some of the things we do in traditional universities, even today, I worked 9 years at a university. Some of the strategies are we teach proximity as a useful classroom management tool. And I've just said to everybody that 50% of our kids almost 50% of our kids today are dealing with trauma. And we've just now told our young teachers to get in their space, go stand in their space, and they'll quietly calm down. Well, we just put the teacher and the student at risk. Anybody who's been abused or neglected don't want anybody in their space. So just little strategies like that, we have to look different. And again, this is all going to play out differently with what we're going through now. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So I went back to my school after I did this conference on at risk and wounded, and I talked to my staff and I said, what do you guys think about this? And I had Joe, who was a retired military Marine sergeant, was on my staff. And then when Joe spoke, he spoke with authority and honor, which he deserved and earned. And Joe stood up and he said, I like this, what you're saying about wounded kids, and here's why. He said, first of all, I think you're telling us to go get the kids we've lost and to quit kicking our kids out of school in record numbers. And he said, I like that because you're teaching me to be a good warrior again. You're teaching me to be a good soldier again. Because you see, a good warrior never leaves anyone in the battlefield wounded. And I thought about that and I thought, wow, that's really powerful. He said, but I'm going to teach you something about battle that you do not understand. And military veterans, friends out there who are listening in, I'm sure you've heard this concept. I've not been in, I'm just going with what Joe told me. So I'm going to honor your service. But Joe said, I'm going to teach you something about battle you don't understand, Dr. Hendershot. You're asking us to go out and get the kids we've lost. And in battle, some of those kids will say, just leave us here to die. But a responsible warrior and a responsible soldier brings them back anyways. So we started this warrior of hope mentality that we were going to go get the kids that we've lost. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of these strategies on how we go get those kids, and what about non-negotiables, and do these apply to the non-negotiables? And I'm going to say it's where these principles probably apply the most, though we do have no non-negotiables. I expelled 25 kids from my one school one year. I stand behind all of them, but the strategies I'm going to talk about applied even there. So it's not that we're soft on rules or anything along those lines. So let's get into this. Now, I started to talk about this, and it really wasn't a business model. I'm probably the least likely person to be doing this. To be quite honest with everybody out there, I was a wounded kid. I grew up with a addicted father. Um, um, when I was 14 years old, I had to live with my aunt and uncle for a very short time. While my dad went and got help. It divided our family. My dad got the help he needed. In the end, overcame his addiction, last 35 years of his life, and helped hundreds, if not thousands, of people overcome their wounds of addiction as well. So one of the reasons we're called Hope for the Wounded is in honor of my dad, because there is hope and trauma can be overcome. And that's the good news of what we're talking about. But I found myself going to more and more conferences, and I'm not a polished speaker by any stretch of the imagination. But you heard that we have foster adopted children, and we got a call for our first adopted child. And my wife asked if I was sitting down, and they told us we were going to get a teenage boy. And she said, no, we got a call, and it's a little girl. She's in the Columbus hospital. She's 5 weeks premature, and she's 4 pounds. She said, what do you think? And I said, I think you're halfway to that hospital. And she said, you're right. I'm in the car with my friend Jody, and we're on our way to the hospital to get this little girl. Now, if I'm being really honest with everybody out there today, I was talking about it, I was writing about it, I was even being introduced as an expert on this topic. And I was really no expert at all. Because before this, I had a judgment card about working with wounded kids. I did, me personally. And the things I want to say to everybody out there today is the things I'm just saying, it's just true of me. May not be true of you, may not be true of anybody you even know. These are just things that were true of me. But I had a judgment card about working with wounded kids. And I'd say things like, well, if they chose better friends, they wouldn't be wounded. Maybe if they had better family, they wouldn't be wounded. Maybe if they had a better community, they wouldn't be wounded. And I had to push blame, and I was looking at better choices, better friends, better families, all this stuff. But when I held my foster daughter, now our daughter, you can see her there in the red shirt. When I held her in my hand, literally one hand, 4 pounds, 5 weeks premature, she changed my whole view of this topic. And I held her, and she spoke this to my heart. She said, Dad, some kids just come into the world wounded. And I had never thought about that. It wasn't a choice. Because if woundedness was a choice, who would choose it? Who would choose what we're going through today in our society? Name that would choose what we're dealing with. So my daughter taught me that some children are just born into the world wounded. And the research is clear, 25% of our kids before the age of preschool are dealing with trauma. So, I mean, we could go into all the statistics again, but I want to really get into what we're going to talk about here today. Again, just the difference between at risk and wounded. First of all, I like to give freebies away. So for all of you out there, if you text the word HOPE to 404-998-4663, I'm going to give you my doctoral dissertation quantitative research that you have my total permission to use with your staff. There's a 21 questionnaire. You can send it out to your staff. You can Google Doc it, send it out, get it back, bar graph it, pie graph it, whatever you want, and it'll give you the information you need to evaluate how you can build your professional development training off these 21 questions through some of the things we're going to talk about. But again, text word HOPE to 404-998-4663. No charge. I'm going to give that to you free today. Look at it, read it. If you think it applicable to you as a superintendent or a school board member, just let me know. Now, I want to say this, I have never been a school board superintendent. I've never been on a school board. I've never been a superintendent. I did do a year internship for my superintendent's license, which I have. Um, so I have a little working knowledge, but I also I've never done the job fully. Went to high school principal, but did a year internship. This year at our national student conference, we were going to have the past National School Board President, Miranda Beard, was going to be our keynote speaker. So I appreciate the work and honor the work. And I know the work that board members and superintendents, administrators do out there on behalf of our wounded children. And I know today, in today's world, what you're doing. I mean, the things I'm hearing from my friends who are superintendents, how they're preparing meals and getting their bus drivers and the heroes of the teachers and the counselors and the cafeteria workers that are still trying to provide meals for kids who need hope during this time. I just really want to honor the work that you're doing and recognize it. We're going to talk about the typologies of wounds and how this applies, maybe even today, maybe even a little bit more. How do you identify wounds? I worked with a guy by the name of Dr. Terry Wardle, who wrote about 11 books, and he said this isn't a clinical definition, but it's a layman's terms on how to identify wounded people. He's given me permission to adjust this for wounded children, so we'll talk about this right now. Hopefully everybody can see this slide. Is that correct?
Correct. We
Okay.
can see it well.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
First of all, do you have kids of wounds of withholding? And what could a child be withheld that can wound them? They could be withheld food, they could be withheld love, shelter, basic needs. I tell the story of my son. We adopted from Ethiopia. When we brought him home from Ethiopia, he couldn't, because he was withheld food. And we took him to the doctor and took x-rays, and he had stress fractures in his body because he could no longer, he could stress fractures. And we asked the doctor for the medicine, and he said there's no medicine. Feed him food and his bones will calcify and he'll be sailing in no time. So I always tell this really quick, kind of humorous story, I guess, depending on what side you fall on this. It's a humorous story about me. I'm a runner. Well, for the purposes of this story, I'm a runner. If you'd have seen me running this morning, you'd have said I'm no runner. But anyways, my son started walking. He was 6 years old when we brought him home, and I'm sorry, 4 years old when we brought him home. So it was about 2 years later, after he started walking, he was starting to run with dad. And it was great for me because I could run slower and shorter than I already ran. But my son at 6 years old wanted to run a 5K race with me. And so I said, okay, we're going to get there. We're about 1,500 people there. We're going to line up. They'll shoot the gun. I said, I'll take off. I'll wait for you at mile 1. I'll wait for you at mile 2. I'll wait for you at mile 3. We're going to finish this one last 1/10 mile together. Won't that be great? And aren't I a great dad? And so we get to the race. They shoot the gun, and off goes my 6-year-old son, Katayo. And so my son takes off. And I thought, well, this isn't working out the way I'd hoped, but that's okay, because what will happen is he'll kind of get tired at mile 1 and I'll scoop him up. He'll get tired at mile 2 and I'll scoop him up. He'll really poop out at mile 3 and I'll scoop him up. We'll finish. Won't that be nice? And aren't I a great dad? The reality is I never caught my son. And when I went to the finish line, stood my son cheering me on. Dad finished strong, and he placed gold medal around his age group. And I got a certificate of participation. I got, I think, 756th place. So I tell that story because people say, well, that's a nice ending to a potentially bad situation. But my son, when he went to school, the one thing we left out was of withholding. He went to the cafeteria as the first time and saw out food. And for him, it wasn't just lunch. It was a matter of life and death. It was a matter of survival. So his wounds of withholding, though he physically healed from those, he still had some trauma to deal with in the school setting. So that's just one example. We have children deal with wounds of aggression in childhood, wounds by stressful events, who could say today that we're not dealing with stressful events and our children aren't, um, even before this, we're having that to grow up with, and that's stressful, and things like that. Wounds of betrayal and wounds caused by long-term duress, and we don't know how long-term we're going to have to be dealing with what we're dealing with today. So the question is, these were things before the pandemic. So what? I mean, my wife just came in before we started here, and she said we just got about half of our order from the grocery store. We're being withheld things that we're not used to being withheld. We got 9 kids, and we're buying dozens of eggs, and there's now saying you get 2 dozen eggs. So things are a little different. Um, but this is the basic model of how you could identify wounds. So we've identified wounds. The question is, what about those wounds? Wounds cause false beliefs. False beliefs cause emotional upheaval. Emotional upheaval causes dysfunctional behavior, and then dysfunctional behavior turns into life situations. Again, this is based off Dr. Wardle's work. So the question is today, is there any emotional upheaval or dysfunctional behavior going on? Well, before the pandemic, let's take out just a regular school day. Superintendents, do you see kids with emotional upheaval and dysfunctional behavior? Of course. Where's that coming from? It comes out of the false beliefs. And what are false beliefs? False beliefs are kids that are saying things like, no one loves me, no one cares about me, I'm not smart enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not, there's nothing worthwhile about me, I'm too big, I'm too small, I'm too heavy, I'm too skinny. Any false beliefs that they want to believe coming out of their trauma. So the question, people always want a real quick example. One of my adopted daughters, I wrote 3 books on the topic. I shouldn't be dealing with this, right? But in reality, I deal with it every day in my home. But my daughter hit me with the home run of all false beliefs just recently when her brother got the last donut. I mean, not that traumatic of a situation, but to her, she immediately went to, I'm always last. I never get what I want. I'm always fall a little bit short. And then she hits me with the home run of all false beliefs, and that's no one loves me. Now her emotions are definitely real. So we don't want to discount our wounded kids' emotions, but the question is, are they true? So I had to figure out, I was taught in school to try to consequence kids out of their behavior. Well, I say you can't consequence kids out of their trauma. So I couldn't really apply a consequence. What I had to do was I had to find out what her false belief was and then feed the truth into that false belief. So I had to stand beside my daughter and say, you know what? That's not true. Because you see, your dad loves you. She said, okay, well, you love me, but no one else loves me. And we had to break down that false belief because mom loves her. And she's got 8 brothers and sisters who love her. She's captain of her soccer team. She's works at the school with the crossing guard. She has a lot of responsibilities and people. So we just have to break down those barriers. And before I knew it, she was back to smiling, and we just went to the store and bought another box of donuts. Again, it's kind of a simplistic, simple view of false beliefs and emotional upheaval and dysfunctional behavior, but one though that is real. And once your teachers understand this and your administrators, most people run from the emotional upheaval and the dysfunctional behavior because they don't know how to deal with it. And once you teach them that it's coming out of trauma and false beliefs, you start to see people running towards this instead of away from it. So an example, I had a teacher one day, we had a kid came into class and to the school, and he was just really dysregulated, dysfunctional, emotional. And it was like all the teachers wanted to deal with it. I don't say all of them knew how to deal with it. And one particular teacher said, let me deal with it. Not somebody else deal with it, let me deal with it. And when I went to counseling, now I messed a lot of things up, but I did one thing right, is I'm not a counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, I'm none of those things. I was an educator, And I went to my school board and I said, quit sending me to principal conferences and curriculum conferences. I know that stuff. I know school law. I don't need to hear that again. Start sending me to counseling conferences. So my counseling friends taught me to ask what questions and not why questions. So taught my teachers that. So a teacher walked up to this kid who was dysregulated and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And this kid very quietly just said, "My mom was supposed to visit me for the 7th weekend in a row, and mom wasn't here. Mom didn't show up." Now, we don't want to throw his mom under the bus because it's still his mom. But the teacher said, "I'm sorry to hear that. But you know what? See, in his mind, if his mom doesn't care, in his mind, the trauma, the false belief is, if my mom doesn't care, then nobody cares." And the teacher had to say, "I'm sorry that your mom didn't show up. We're hoping she's okay. But the reality is, we care about you here. We really care about your day. We care about who you are. What can we do for you?" Well, I didn't have breakfast, so then we had to deal with that trauma and that wound. So again, it's not trying to consequence kids out of their trauma. Um, so trying to get kids to bring their wounds to the surface. I got my black belt in karate a number of years ago, and my instructor, when he gave it to me, said, "Always keep your wounds to the surface because that's the only way they'll heal." And I knew that sounded really profound. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but now I know what it means. So, it's trying to get kids' wounds to the surface so they can heal. So we have, again, the aggression, stressful events, betrayal, and long-term duress are the ways to identify it. And then you get your teachers to look at the wounds, the false beliefs, emotional upheaval, dysfunctional behavior, and because we don't want it to turn into a life situation. Um, and again, what are some of the false beliefs and emotional people we're going to have? We just wrote our book in February. We had no idea the pandemic was coming. We've been writing this book for the past year, my wife and I, on supporting the wounded educator, because we've been doing this since 2006, and people have said to us, "Joe, we understand we have wounded kids, but what about us? What about us? What about us dealing with our stuff?" And I thought about myself and my own career. I thought about how true that was, that when we lose kids in car wrecks and we're always consoling and helping those around us, we don't self-care. So that's a book about self-care. And so we call it Supporting the Wounded Educator. So again, we have our own false beliefs as educators across the country. When I go speak, I inevitably hear somebody say, "Joe, I understand this stuff, but I'm just a teacher." Now, what a false belief that is. We are look at the influence. The second biggest influence in a child's life next to a parent is an educator. So we want to support our educators, our superintendents, principals, teachers, support staff, the good work that everybody puts in to our kids. We talk about empathy, um, our ability to identify with the feelings and the perspective of others. Um, Mother Teresa once said, "The ills of society." Now I'm not Catholic, but she's a saint, so I'm gonna go with it. So I'm gonna paraphrase her, not quote her. I'll paraphrase her because I don't think I could say it as eloquently as she did. But she said, "The ills of society today is based on the fact that we've become indifferent to the needs of our brothers and sisters." Indifference is the opposite of empathy. So normally before this pandemic, we talked about things like school shootings and things like that, and talked about how things like, people call them hate crimes. And I say, I think they're more crimes of indifference, because indifference means you just don't care. And I think what's happening today in our world and with what's going on, I think we're becoming more empathic with one another because we're all in the same boat. And it doesn't matter what country you're in right now, doesn't matter what nationality, doesn't matter, it just doesn't matter. Social class, we're all having empathy towards one another right now. We haven't had in a very long time. So again, I talk empathy and not just teaching empathy to our kids, positioning them to experience connections with one another. that you must not just identify the feeling, but to feel what someone feels. I did my doctoral dissertation on education, and I had research high. And one day I put it all together. Can you guys still see me? Notification.
Yeah, we can see you great, Dr. Hendershot.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Here you go.
So I was doing my research on empathy for my doctoral dissertation, and one day I got frustrated by all the terms and the definitions and theorists and all that. And not that that's not unimportant; it's all important part of research. Um, but I figured I talked with probably over 3,000 kids in my time in treatment centers, lack of facilities, uh, juvenile corrections. And I thought, Joe, what are they saying about this term empathy? What do they have to say? And it hit me all of a sudden when I would ask kids what's going on in their life, the thing the counselors taught me to ask, what questions, not why questions. And I would ask a kid what's going on, and the kid would tell me what's going on. A kid would say this at the end, and many of you have heard this. Kids will tell you their story. They'll say, do you feel me? Do you feel what I'm saying? So if we go to feel what someone else feels, our kids today are telling us exactly what they want. And we say they aren't, we can't really figure our kids out today, but our kids today are really telling us when they say, do you feel me? They're saying, I need more empathy. I need you to connect with me on an emotional level. I need you to feel my pain before I can have a relationship. And we could talk. I could do a whole webinar on relationships, the importance of relationships, and in the research, 81,499 students in 26 states and 110 said the number one reason why kids are dropping out of school is relevancy in relationships. I could talk about the importance of having relationships. The research that a gentleman who was a police officer told me, and do the research, he said the number one way to avert school shooters is to get a kid involved with a meaningful relationship with an adult. That's one thing, is to have every kid in a meaningful would do so much because it connects. We're meant to be connected. So when I hear people say that I was at an averting school conference, and a police officer told me that was the research. And again, it's another thing about relationships. So I encourage school districts to have, if you don't have a mentorship program, put one in place, because it teaches empathy and that connectiveness. And how important is empathy? Probably one of the worst crimes against humanity, Holocaust crimes, but against humanity, but one is the Holocaust. The judge of the trial concluding statement was that the Holocaust was a failure of empathy. That's how important empathy is. So we have to pay attention, to this model of empathy and how important it is in the kids. Again, I want to say this, and a little vulnerable when I say this, but again, I just want to honor the work that you're doing. John Steinbeck once said this. He said that educators in a lifetime that make the difference is the best of luck. And I want all of you to hear this out there, that I best of luck for, like you, I best of luck. I told you a little bit about my history, a little bit about my background already. Three educators that poured into my life, in addictive life. And if it wasn't for people like do the work that you do, I wouldn't be where I. So I believe in who you are, you do. I personally am a product of who you are and what you do. I graduated high school. I was going through that stuff with my family. I barely graduated high school. When I mean barely, I think they graduated me as a favor. I'm not proud of that comment. I'm just being honest. But again, I know this is who you are and what you do anyways. And I want you, before I go into another strategy of off empathy, I just want to take this moment to talk about self-care, because our um, supporting the wounded we talk about the difference between compassion fatigue and compassion fatigue is, are you compassionate? So I ask you the question out there: are you compassionate? The answer is yes, obviously. Are you tired? Yes. Do you keep giving of yourself anyways? Yes. Especially in these times that we're dealing with. I know so many of you you work long hours anyways. I can't even imagine the hours that you're putting in. Well, I can, because I have friends who are superintendents right now and school board members, and the hours they're putting in are incredible to on behalf of being warriors of hope for our kids. But I just wanted to say that to self-care, don't forget, whether you need to journal, whether you need to turn off the TV for a while, whether you need to take whatever it is that you do to, read a good book, call a trusted friend, whatever it is, I took up swimming at one point just because that was a way I could disconnect. I know that's hard for us to do today because of our inability to kind of move about, get to those places. But there are some things we can do. My wife journals every day. I journal some days, so that's something she finds a little more common than I do. But I like to call friends, so that's how I stay and talk to people. Anyways, I just want to take that moment, because self-care literally turns to burnout. Sorry, I'm going a little fast here. I'm trying to pack into an hour here, and I'm trying to keep track of the time out of respect for you. Um, so usually in education, we talk about being burnout, and that's true. You can get to a place of burnout, and if you get burned out, then you usually just quit. Um, but what a lot of us deal with is compassion fatigue. We look at this comprehensive approach to self-care, social emotional learning in our schools, that yes, we want to take care of our wounded children. Yes, we want to we want to pour empathy into their lives. But to have a comprehensive approach to this whole thing, we have to also self-care, take care of ourselves so we can take care of the children. And how this is all going to play out once we come back, I don't think anyone knows. I know I certainly don't know how this is all going to play out once we reconvene the schools. What kind of impact this is going to on our children. I can say that my own children, 12, and I have a 10 and a 9-year-old, they're doing homeschooling, and they talk about teachers. And I think of the cool, I had a teacher call the other day, called my son's 14 and said, Katayo, hey, this is Mr. Andrew, and I just want to let you know that I miss you and I care about you and I just love you. I just need to let you know that. I mean, what an amazing thing to happen, during this time, and how that'll help ease some of that once we return. Just the other day, a teacher ran up on our pot of flowers with a little note attached and ran off. Uh, and my son saw him, and the teacher just reminded the student that they cared about him. And so we've just got amazing stories of humanity going on throughout this time. But I'm going to again encourage all of you to please take time for yourself and self-care, families, and the importance of spending time with your as well. So we talked about empathy. Um, I could go on, do a whole podcast just on empathy, but I'm going to go on and move on to, because I think people really are looking for is maybe some strategies even before this. But one of the things, superintendents and school board members, we had a high expulsion rate at school I was at, and we got together with the staff, and usually we had a division. And if you don't have a common vision, you have division. So we had to have a common vision on how we were dealing with these kids. And we found out that a lot of our kids were wounded kids. And so we came up with a common vision. And one thing we were doing was doing a lot of suspensions and expulsions, as I had mentioned. And one of the things, how do you handle all this? How do you handle the expulsions and still, have empathy and still follow the rules and still, deal with their trauma and their woundedness? So superintendent was getting about 20 angry parent phone calls a month due to suspensions and expulsions. And so we got together and we took the research of relationships. We just went back to that simple thing of relationships, how critical that is. And what we decided was, as a staff, we came to a common vision that we were going to start a community service program and have kids do community service instead of suspending them. So we would tell kids, we want you to stay in class with us, stay in school with us. We don't want to put you out in the streets where you're going to learn when you're in your seat, not out on the streets. And so we started community service programs. So teachers would say to kids, hey, yeah, this behavior is wrong, but instead of suspending you, we have community service on Tuesdays and Thursdays after school, and that'll be your meaningful consequence. And we had teachers and principals and superintendent gave school bus. We'd go around the town from 2:30 to 4:30 and give back to the community as a consequence for the behavior. And kids really felt good about themselves because they were given to their community, they were pouring into their community. Instead of kicking them out of community, we were pouring them into it. So we found this, and we did this for a number of years, and we just found the behaviors changed. Graduation went up, academics went up, suspensions, expulsions went down. All the things we're about. I've had a lot of schools follow this model throughout the United States, and I'm getting lots of results from people saying, wow, it's really cool because it's really changed. Now, it's not going to change. There's no one thing that changes every kid, but the thing is, does every kid deserve an opportunity to have a meaningful consequence instead of a punishment per se? Put your head down and sit in detention. We had them doing things for the community. So again, it's all part of the comprehensive approach, tuning in to what our educators needed to connect, build that relationship with the kids. We wrote a grant and paid our teachers for their time to work with the kids after school, or the principals, superintendents, again, were kind to get the buses so we could move around the community. So again, we don't have a lot of time for a lot of strategies. We have strategies on our website. When we do all-day trainings, we give a lot of strategies, but that's just one simple one. In fact, it changed. We went from 20 angry parent phone calls and the superintendent doing a lot of suspensions and expulsions complaints to 1 expulsion in 3 years by doing this program. Now, what do you do with the kids that are non-negotiable? That's an important question. We had a kid that brought drugs to school one time, and that's a non-negotiable. And in the expulsion hearing, I asked the superintendent if I could have the last word. And she said to me, that depends, what are you going to say? And I said, well, I'm not real sure, but I'm going to try to follow my model here. So the child got expelled. That's a non-negotiable for bringing drugs to school. There's no doubt about it. The child had to go to juvenile court, had the files charged against him, all that. But at the end of the expulsion hearing of 80 days expulsion, the superintendent said, Mr. Hendershot has something he'd like to say. And I said to the young man, I wanted to leave him with a redeeming quality, because we have to ask ourselves, does every kid have a redeeming quality? And I had to dig a little bit, but I said to this young man, I said, you got to pay this consequence, 80 days. We have drug alcohol counselors here for you. I'm not an expert in that, but please go with them during your expulsion and get the help you need, because drugs will destroy your life if you don't get this under control. But I want to say this about you. You were honest through this whole process, and honesty is a great quality. I just left it at that. The next day, the kid came back to school with his dad. The first day of his expulsion, they weren't even supposed to be on school property. And the dad said to me, can we speak to you? I said, sure. And he said, we got home last night and we were talking about the things you said about my son. I said, well, I said a lot of things about your son. He said, no, the part about my son being honest. I said, yes. He said, my son has something he'd like to share with you. His son reached in his hip pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper, said, Mr. Hendershot, here's 25 other kids that has drugs in your school. My first response was, oh boy, oh no, I've gone too far. This is going to be a lot of work. And but the kid by me leaving him with a redeeming quality, even though he still paid the consequence, even though there was a non-negotiable, I left him with a redeeming quality, and he lived up to that the very next day by me just simply saying, you were honest through this whole process, that he took full responsibility. He still didn't get away with anything. Um, and so we waited a few days and brought the drug dogs in, and our school wasn't drug free after that, but it was a lot cleaner than it was before that. So that's just one example of, even this can work with kids with even expulsions. It's not a program, it's a philosophy, if you will. I'm going to go through, and I think we're getting towards our end time here. I'm just kind of looking at my notes and going through. I guess the one thing I want to say is, we know, and you all know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, that all behavior has meaning. All behavior has meaning. And if you're going to take away a child's behavior, you have to replace it with something more powerful. And that's usually relationships, connectiveness, hope, creating vision, allowing your kids to dream. A lot of wounded kids have lost their dreams. They're just trying to get through the day, survive the day. They're not thinking about tomorrow. They're not thinking, because we know this. First of all, let me just say this. I have three steps: understanding, reaching, and transforming. And I don't believe you can reach anybody unless you first understand them. And I don't believe you can transform them unless you can reach them. So the first thing you have to do is get your staff to understand these wounded children, to reach them, then to transform them. A lot of us want to get to the transformation piece without skipping those first two parts. But if those first two parts are the relationship piece, the understanding and the reaching. We also know this about wounded kids, and we also know this about ourselves. We're either in emotional, survival, or critical thinking at any given time. Would like to think everybody out there right now is just critically thinking. I would love to think that every student that I teach every day is just sitting there ready to critically think. And I hope that's true. And I really do. I hope that's true of you. I hope that's true of every kid that you work with. But reality is we're either in emotional survival or critical thinking. And some of the things we're dealing with in today's world are things none of us could have ever predicted. So how many people are in emotional? How many are in survival? And how many people are critically thinking? So superintendents and school board members, I know you're dealing with things like, I know in my handbook, we did intruder drills, fire drills, drills for drills, tornado drills, but I don't remember. And maybe you did, but I never remember having anything prepared for a pandemic in my school handbook. A lot of schools are working on this on their feet, getting teachers up to speed on technology, getting what about kids that had internet that now can't afford internet? What about kids that Chromebook breaks, and how do they get out to get it fixed? And there's so many things. I just know it's tough. It's just really a tough thing. But we're all in it together, and we all understand that. And I see a lot of people pitching in and helping out. Probably one of the last stories I'll tell. I worked with a wounded kid for 4 years, and this kid was one of those. I talk about grace and mercy, and in our dictionary, grace and mercy is defined as a temporary exemption or a compassionate treatment in Webster's Online Dictionary. And but I used up about all the grace and mercy with this kid I worked with for 4 years, and I got down to his senior year. And I told the young man, I said, you really can't come back to my office again. It's going to probably ruin your graduation. You get in any more trouble, it's probably going to put you in real jeopardy. I said, you only got a couple months of school left. You just leave my office and please don't come back. And for someone to get me to that level was kind of like, I was just really trying to save him. Really, don't come back because I don't want you in trouble anymore. But the very next day, I wanted to do a picture of our children for my wife's birthday. I went to the Art 4 teacher and I said, send me your most gifted and talented student. Ryan came running into my office the next day The kid I said to never come back to my office, he comes in and I'm like, hey, why are you here? I told you not to come back here. He says, I'm here to do the picture of your kids for your wife's birthday. And I thought, if I'm being really honest, I thought, wow, this isn't going to be that good, you know. And I want to say this about the arts in the middle of this story. You know, when I was an administrator and I had to cut programs, the first thing I would cut would be the arts, art and music. I'm not saying you did, I'm not saying you should. I'm just telling you what I did. I cut the arts, music, things like that. But what was interesting, when I went to work in treatment centers as a principal, the very first classes I was required to put them in was art and music therapy. So the very things I took away from kids were the very things that we'd use to give them therapy to heal. So just a little side note from the story from Ryan. So I really thought this picture really wasn't going to be all that great. But I threw down a little wallet-sized picture I just took of my kids, and I said, here, Ryan, have at it. Ryan left. A couple weeks later, he comes back with this picture. And I'll show it to you here in just a second. But I had Ryan come over to my wife's surprise birthday party, and we set it. We had it framed and under glass and on an easel with a towel over it. And Ryan stands up. And he says, "Yeah, Mr. Endershot asked me to do this picture for your birthday. It's not really that great, but I hope you enjoy it." And this was one of those kids that was kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out all the time. One of those kids that, you know, kind of drove me a little bit crazy, but a nice kid overall. You know, so here's the picture. There's a picture that Ryan did of my children. And what Ryan taught me was simply this. Ryan taught me this. For 4 years, I worked with this kid, and I thought I was his teacher. For 4 years, I thought I knew Ryan. I really didn't know Ryan. I didn't know he had this gift, and we say that every child has a gift. And see, that's something I can't teach. That's a belief system that you own or you don't own. That's not a teachable thing, you know. And but it was something that I owned, that I said it, but I really didn't believe it. But Ryan became my teacher. See, Ryan became my teacher, and he did teach me that every child has a gift. Every child has a gift. And so that's a pencil drawing. Ryan did that with a pencil. And I told him I was going to share this with everybody across the country. He's actually been at conferences and has shared this story. He tells it much better than I do. And for the sake of time, I didn't give him the great detail. But, you know, I guess in closing, I hope I've presented you with just a different view of the difference between at-risk and wounded kids. How we, you know, in our book, we found the research, 70% of our educators today, before what's taking place, have dealt with some type of trauma in their life. And we're going to come back together. At some point, we're going to come back together. What that's going to look like, I think, is we're going to have an empathic culture. Sorry, my phone just beeped. I should have had it off. I think we're going to have a more empathic culture with one another. I think our teachers are just going to love these kids more than they ever have. I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. I think there's a lot of hope for the wounded. You know, I think there's a lot of woundedness going on right now. But there's hope. And I just, again, everyone out there in the audience today, just please know and share this message of hope with your children, with your community, with your students, with your families. That again, there is hope for the wounded, and I've grown so much because of educators like you. And I want, if you hear this from no one else, I'm going to leave you with this. I'm down to 1 minute. If you hear this from no one else, please hear this from me. I honor the work that you do. And I'm so appreciative at this time, the work that you're doing on behalf of our children and our communities. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Joe Hendershot of Hope for the Wounded. Thank you for drawing our attention to the topic of woundedness. You know, as trustees and superintendents, I don't think we've reflected enough on this topic of woundedness and how it isn't a choice. Who in his or her right mind would choose to be wounded? But all of our kids, I appreciate the reminder that all of our kids have redeeming qualities. All of them have gifts. So it just requires of us a bit more empathy in the meantime.
Can I just say one last thing?
Go for it. Before, because I want to say something about your books as well. What do you have to say?
If you have any, well, I'll let you say something about the books, but if you want to get in contact with us, we're hopeforthewounded.org. We have I think next week we have a 3-day podcast available. It's all on our website. 3-day to 12-hour, 3-day 12 podcast. Webinar, sorry, webinar. I'm getting all my technology terminology correct. And our Twitter is at Hope for the Wounded. But I just wanted to share our website because all our information's on there.
Tremendous. I just want to say, Dr. Hendershot, thank you for the resources that you're offering our community, not only during this webinar, but also the works that you've published on this. Reaching the Wounded Student, I know, is your first work published in this area. And then after that, you came out with 7 ways to transform the lives of wounded students. But also now that you and Darty have co-published, co-written, Supporting the Wounded Educator. That is the one I haven't read yet, so I need to get my hands onto that. I'm going to go online right after this webinar, and I just want to encourage all the rest of us too, with the budgets that we have, how tremendous it would be to be making sure that we're getting resources like these into the hands of those who are working with our students. Any last words, Dr. Hendershot?
I have to just leave it again. I just hopes and thoughts are with everybody across the country and with all of you and your families and your communities. So blessings to all of you.
There we go. Thank you. Appreciate very much your time. Dr. Hendershot of Hope for the Wounded, the co-sponsor of this webinar today. For those who are listening, we'd like to encourage you to continue with us next Monday. We'll have our Más Hablemos conversation at noon on the COVID-19 pandemic for superintendents and trustees and others who are interested in hearing the latest news happening here in Texas and throughout the nation regarding the pandemic and its effect on education. But also our next Más Aprendamos webinar will be next Wednesday, April the 15th, with Consuelo Castillo Kickbush and Roy Juarez Jr. They're going to continue speaking about the 4 steps of courageous leadership. So please tune in next Wednesday at noon. That'll be April the 15th with Consuelo Castillo Kickbush and Roy Juarez Jr. talking about the 4 steps of courageous leadership. Appreciate y'all joining us today. Have a great day.